Hi, and welcome to our next video of the course History of English 2 from Synthetic to Analytic. In this penultimate video, we are going to have a look at the late modern English, the phase of English that was spoken in the 18th and 19th century. And what we are going to do today is that I will introduce three sort of subtle grammatical innovations in English that happened during the 19th century. And with this as a background, we are going to have a meta-linguistic discussion in our online session next week. Right, so the three phenomena that we're going to discuss today is first the expansion of the progressive and the so-called passival construction. The second point will be the rise of the auxiliary have in perfect constructions. And finally, we're going to talk a bit about the passive constructions with the auxiliary get. So let's start with the expansion of the progressive construction. Right. So as you all probably know, in English, we have the option to either use the verb in the progressive form or not. And by opting for the progressive form, we can make an aspectual distinction, right? We don't have to, but we can. An example would be, for example, this, that if we say, when we arrived, she was calling the police, instead of when we arrived, she called the police, we can make the distinction between whether the action represented by the verb here in bold, whether that action was already finished or not, right? So if we say she was calling the police, she was still calling the police when we arrived, she called the police when we arrived, the call was already over. But this is not all, right? With using the progressive form, we can also, for example, express the durative or punctual nature of the action at hand. So, for example, the sentence, they argued all through the meal, as opposed to they were arguing all through the meal, says something about whether we see the action as one instance or as something that had a longer duration, which would be they were arguing all through the meal, right? Or it can also mean something like whether it is a stable thing or only a phase, right? So if we have a look at the two sentences at the bottom, so Jeffrey is not himself today, and Jeffrey is being himself again. So if we say is being, we mean that he would act differently, but at this very moment there is something special going on. But then there are also some sort of more or less strict restrictions for verbs that can appear in this progressive constructions and which not. For example, stative verbs such as London is being in England would not really be used in the progressive form, or verbs of possession like I am having a brother or things like that. That would also be off. Right, but basically, it can be used in all sorts of contexts in the present-day English. But this was not always the case, right? For example, what we in present-day English can say are things like the house was being built last time I checked, which would be a passive progressive, or a progressive form with a prepositional phrase. With past participle. He has been being interrogated, or the progressive with a modal verb such as it should have been being handled accordingly. All these things are completely okay in the present-day English, in present-day English. But in early modern English and in late modern English, this, for example, the passive progressive especially, was definitely not okay. So the house was being built was not a viable construction in the beginning of the 19th century. Instead of that, we had the so-called passival construction, which basically refers to a construction, to a present participle that has passive meaning. And I'll give you here a couple of examples. So for instance, a sentence such as "the bridge is building" in late modern English, beginning of the 19th century, would be used to mean the bridge is being built, or our garden is putting in order by our gardener. Is putting in order would be used. This is the passival form instead of is being put in order. Or the meal was eating, right? Instead of the meal was or is being eaten. And last example, right? The trunks were carrying down instead of the trunks were being carried down, right? So there was we have in present day English the restriction, the sort of semantic restriction that, for example, stative verbs cannot be used in the progressive. London is being the capital of England. In late modern English, we had a different type of restriction. We had a formal restriction, so that the progressive form, being, was not able to combine this form together with a passive form, right? So the bridge is building, progressive form on its own, that was fine. And the bridge is built, that was also fine. The passive form or the past participle form on its own, that was also okay. But is being built, that was too much. And we're going to have a look at it in more detail in a second. It might seem like a strange thing, the bridge is building and so forth, but we should not forget that we actually have something like that in present-day English as well. It's called the middle voice, and it describes a situation when we use a formally active voice, but we understand it as a passive construction, right? So, for example, we have the construction, the window broke, right? Or the door opens. And we don't really mean that the window does something, right? Or the door doesn't open because the window did something. The window doesn't break on its own, and the door doesn't open because the door wants to open, but somebody opens the door and somebody broke the window, right? So what it basically means would be the window was broken, the door was opened or is opened. And if I'm telling somebody about my driving experience, I would say something like, this car drives like a tank. And I don't really mean that it is an automatic car that drives on its own, but that I am driving it and it, right? It can be driven like a tank. Right. So here are a couple of more examples of the passival construction, right? So we already know this one. Our garden is putting in order by a man, and so forth, right? So our garden is being put in order. Then, right? But are there 6 laborers' sons educating in the universities at this moment, right? So educating here means, are they being educated? Or the street lamps were lighting instead of were being lit. And here, right, baskets and so forth had been carrying, were being carried. And it's got scenes in a theater where a ballet's dancing, right, where a ballet's being danced. Right. Right. Also, this passival form has some restrictions. It cannot, for example, be used with intransitive verbs. Right. So, for example, verbs such as to go would not be able to be used in this construction. Right. Another thing that is problematic with this, or formally problematic with this construction, is when it should be when it would be used with animate subjects such as humans or animals, right? Animals. Then the passival construction becomes ambiguous between its passive reading and its active reading, right? So if we have a sentence such as "the king is dressing," without the context, it might be ambiguous whether we mean the king is being dressed by someone else or the king is dressing himself. Right. And in the first half of the 19th century, right, we see the rise, actually a very steep rise of the progressive passive, so the thing that we would use nowadays, and a very sort of a gradual decline of the passival. I mean, the passival construction was never something that was extremely often or extremely frequently used, but its use declined during the early modern English and late modern English period. Okay. And sort of the progressive form, right? The progressive passive has its antecedents already in Old English, right? So in Old English, we have things like he was huntiende, he was hunting, where the present participle of a verb is used just as an adjective would be used, right? So he was blissjende, he was happy, would be the same, similar construction to he was hunting. And then in Old English, we also have a sort of a locative construction that can be used in the progressive sense. So we have things like he was on huntunge, he was at a hunt, right? Or he was on Templer Lehrende, he was in the temple teaching. And this is actually something very similar to what we find in other Germanic languages, for example, in Dutch or German, where we would have the construction with a preposition and an infinitive or a noun or a deverbal noun. So we would have in Dutch, hij is aan het schrijven, he is writing right now, or in German, is am schrijven, with the same meaning. And we actually find similar sort of remnants of this old English locative progressive construction in present-day English as well. This is this sort of very archaic construction with an a prefix on verbs, right? So, for example, from this Christmas carol, seven swans are swimming. This is basically the old English preposition on, and or right, soldiers of France, the eyes of Europe are looking at you. Again, a preposition that was originally a separate word but got merged with the verb that follows. Right, but let's move on to the next thing, the perfect auxiliary have. Also something that changed during the late modern English period. So nowadays, present-day English basically only uses one auxiliary for the present perfect construction, and that is have. And this is similar to the Germanic Scandinavian languages. And for example, also, this is the same case with Afrikaans, the daughter language of Dutch spoken in South Africa. But this is a different situation from that in Dutch and German. So in English, I would say I have built a house and I have arrived. In both cases, I would have the same auxiliary, but this would not be the case in Dutch or German, right? In present-day English, we have a different auxiliary only in very specific contexts, either very archaic or biblical, right? So you might know this sentence from Oppenheimer when the atomic bomb was first used. He said the sentence, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I am become death, right? The auxiliary is here the verb to be and not have. And in late modern English, during the 19th century and 18th century, we still have the system where there are two auxiliaries, have and be. And in late modern English, I was arrived, I am come, and I am become would be the normal thing. Whereas I have arrived, I have come, and I have become would be sort of the progressive thing that is developing at that time. Right? And the system basically works the same way as the system you know from German or from Dutch, where verbs, or mutative verbs that refer to changes or verbs of movement are very frequently associated with the auxiliary to be, and the rest is associated with have. Right? So you have Jana ist gelaufen, Jana has ran, Jana ist reich geworden, has become rich. Right? So gelaufen, a verb of movement, reich geworden, a verb of a mutative verb referring to a change, and the same thing would also apply for Dutch. And during the 19th century, we see basically a rise of the use of have in these mutative verbs and also of the verbs of movement. And we see that approximately in the first half of the 19th century, we reach the 50% mark, and where half of the verbs are used with have and half are used with be, and later on the auxiliary have basically becomes the default auxiliary. And there are only very few examples when we don't use them. Okay. So now let's have a look at the passive construction with get. So first, a couple of words about the so-called get passive. In present-day English, when we want to form a passive construction, we basically have two different options when it comes to the auxiliary. We either use the normal auxiliary with to be, and then we would have a sentence such as this: the trees in the garden were damaged in the wind, right? But what we also can do would be to use the auxiliary get, and we would get, and we would then get a sentence such as this: the trees in the garden got damaged in the wind, and the so-called get passive. The get passive is usually seen as a more informal way of expressing the state of affairs, and is very often used in negative contexts, right? So things like they worked there for 3 years, but they still got sacked. He feels his paintings are always getting criticized. Our car got stolen last night. My purse got stolen. I got robbed. Things like that. But it's not exclusively a negatively connotated construction. So we would also have things like, I've got good news for you, Jim finally got promoted, or they got married in Las Vegas, and so forth. And this get passive is also something that starts or that gradually rises in the 19th century. And it starts with a general rise of construction with the auxiliary get, right? Things like get in combination with an adjective. She got angry, she gets angry, things like that. Or sort of a causative construction where get is combined with a noun and an adjective. She got the boat ready, she got the house built, and so forth. Or we even have constructions with get, then sort of a reflexive, such as oneself, himself, and so forth, and a past participle. She got herself arrested, right? So she caused that she was arrested, and so forth. And this rise of these get constructions happened around the year 1800, so beginning of the 19th century, right? And several decades later, around the middle of the 19th century, 1850, we see a similar rise of the frequency of the get passive constructions, right? So first we see a rise in different constructions with get, and only later on we get this passive construction with get rising as well. Right. So we see it here combined, right? So the get passive with the round dots is something that rises only more gradually than the general constructions with get, but it is also something that happens during the first half of the 19th century, approximately. Right. So what we see during the late modern English period, among other things, of course, there are also other things happening, but now we're only focusing on these three, is the rise of the passive progressive and the basically total decline of the so-called passival. What we also then see is the rise of the auxiliary have in contexts where originally the auxiliary be would be used. And ultimately, we also see a rise of the so-called get passive, get as an auxiliary. So, and these three developments, and bearing in mind that these three developments happened in around the same time, next time during our online session, we are going to have a look at the meta-discourse about these changes. So we are going to have a look at how people, and in this case, grammar authors of grammar books, how grammarians viewed these developments in their time, right? So how they described them, what ideas they had, what ideologies, and how they simply viewed these instances of language change. And your task until next time would be to have a look at the handout that is uploaded on Blackboard and read the passages from the different grammar books and try to answer the following questions. That is all for now. Thank you all for watching, and see you next week. Bye.